trace Darwin's footsteps through the Galapagos and figure out how he figured it out and when he did that, which it turns out was not on the islands. So again, that little beach is way down there that we spent the night, and you hike up here. This is where Darwin went his first day. Hiked up in what he called the craterized district, because it reminded him of the crater of the sort of factory districts of the Midlands in England, where there was all these different volcanoes. And he deduced correctly, as it turns out, because he was a good geologist. He read Charles Lyell's book, Principles of Geology, on the way there. And he deduced that this was once an island itself, separate from this island, and then they connected through lava flows. That is correct. And he made notes about this. This is the page from his notes. That's that Cerro Brujo volcano there. It's not supposed to be perfectly accurate. It's like a representation of the geology there. And so we went there with our notes and basically compared to there. And that little island that's called Kicker Rock, it's just the core of a volcano that's then been washed away, and that's what's left on the inside, which he then had an illustration of in his travel log of the voyage, which was his first book, and there it is up close. So when he was there, he noted, I'll read it out loud for those of you in the back. He said, I have not as yet noticed by far the most remarkable feature in the natural history of this archipelago. It is that the different islands, to a considerable extent, are inhabited by a different set of beings. My attention was first called to this fact by the vice-governor, Mr. Lawson, declaring that the tortoises differed from the different islands, and that he could with certainty tell from which island anyone was brought. So, for example, here are 5 different tortoises from 5 different islands, and they all have slightly different carapaces, or the shapes of their shells. For example, this one has a very high arching shape, because this particular tortoise on Hispaniola eats these cactus pads that are very high up. And sort of an arms race between the cactus and the tortoises, so the cactus keep growing higher and higher, and the tortoises have to stand up and stretch their neck. Anyway, you get one of these evolutionary arms races. Well, that sounds like natural selection, but in fact, Darwin noted that later, not while he was there. And in fact, we know that had he been an evolutionist, had he discovered evolution, while he was there, he would have been interested in the principle of divergence. That is, a species lands on an island and then it radiates out to the different islands and becomes slightly different in the slightly different environments there. But in fact, and to do that, he would have recorded which islands he got which tortoise specimens from, as well as the famous Darwin's finches. Well, he didn't. He didn't even bother to record the islands from which the tortoises were, and he had quite a supply of them on the ship. Not to take home as specimens, but to eat on the way home, because it's fresh meat kept in the bowels of the ship, and you hardly have to feed or water them to keep them alive, and they last for months. And so they would eat them and then throw them overboard. So Darwin ate his data, and that's how we know that he was not an evolutionist. Even the famous finches, he didn't record the islands from which they came. And Frank went to Cambridge and actually got the specimens. Those are Darwin's original specimens that he brought back from the Beagle. They still have them there in the museum. And it wasn't until Darwin got home in 1837 that he went to see John Gould, the world's leading ornithologist, and laid out his specimens and said, can you help me figure out what these are? And how they would have diverged when they got out there, and so on and so forth. Because he still hadn't quite put it all together. In fact, Frank found Darwin's notes of that particular meeting that afternoon with John Gould, and there's like a little sketch of like a possum upside down there, and these are all his notes. The handwriting of Darwin is pretty difficult to read, but with practice, people like Frank can read this stuff. Anyway, it was Frank who figured out that it wasn't until he was sitting there that afternoon in the spring of 37 that, whoops, I should have recorded the islands from which they came. That might be important. And then he went back to some of his shipmates, including Fitzroy, and said, do you remember what island we were at? Remember we were hiking? And that sort of thing. And tried to piece it together, which he then did after the fact. Even in Darwin's ornithological catalog about his mockingbird collection, he wrote, when I see these islands in sight of each other, and possessed of but a scanty stock of animals, tenanted by these birds, but slightly differing in structure, and filling the same place in nature, I must suspect that they are only varieties. When Darwin uses the word suspect, he means believe. I believe that they're only varieties. He's saying that, and this was the prevailing belief at the time, it was clear that species were created by the Creator. That's what everybody believed. But that they also varied a little bit. I mean, every breeder knows that for every set of offspring you have, they vary a little bit from the parents. Okay, well, what's going on with that? That was, the description of that was not natural selection. To poor Darwin, it was a description of how nature works to keep the originally created kind of their essence the same, not too variable. So picture a bell-shaped curve, a variation of any particular trait, and what nature does is it weeds out the sports, the mutants, the ones that aren't quite close to the center of what the essence of the being is. It's an Aristotelian notion. The core essence of a being, this is who you are. This is what you stand for. These are your characteristics, and if you didn't have those, you wouldn't be that, you'd be something else. And those things are fixed. And that's what everybody believed, and that's what Darwin is referring to here. They're just varieties of a fixed kind. That's all they are. And so he was still a creationist when he was in the Galapagos. It wasn't until he got home and he opened his notebooks, and in 1838, 39, 40, 41, 42, he's constantly making notes. He makes this famous sketch of the Darwin, the first tree of life, where one species gives rise to these different branches and twigs, and that's the principle of this adaptive radiation, as we call it today, which is called divergent. One species lands somewhere, let's say from the mainland out to the Galapagos. You just need one couple, one pregnant female, anything to get started, and just a big clod of dirt and trees with some bugs on it, and out it goes. This sounds improbable, but in fact, every time there's a massive hurricane, like Katrina or the one in Southeast Asia, they constantly find huge blocks of dirt with trees and junk on them and animals floating along thousands of miles from the mainland. It happens all the time. Darwin put that to the test. That tree is now so, that tree of life, that sketch is so famous, you can get it as a tattoo, apparently. Now that's dedication to your science there. I have no idea who that is. It just found it on the internet. The original, in the publication in 1859, that's the tree of life that Darwin has a lengthy description of how you get from here up to here. And this, of course, is one of the great myths that monkeys and apes and humans, well, if we came from the apes, how come they're still around? Well, because that's not how it works. You know, us and the apes and the primates and so on are here, the common ancestors down here. That principle comes from Darwin. So he publishes the book in 1859. He had all that laid out in 1840, early 1840s. He wrote a paper in 1842, another one in 1844, didn't publish them, showed them to some people, wrote some letters to other scientists like Asa Gray at Harvard. And all that mattered later in 1858 when Darwin got a letter from Alfred Russel Wallace, who was in the Malay Archipelago, who was also a naturalist, who also had some ideas about what we would call adaptive radiation and what happens when environments change and over time and species varieties become different actual species. Once they become reproductively isolated, and so they can't meld their gene pools anymore, and they're slightly different, and then they become ever more different, they diverge from the original kind, and the varieties become new species. And Wallace wrote all this down in a feverish evening and mailed it off by boat to Darwin. One person, he thought, hey, Darwin might be interested in this. He wasn't just interested in it. He said, these are like the chapter heads of my book. Oh my God, I'm going to get scooped. So he rushed into print and got The Origin of Species out in about 18 months. So the priority will make the pen move fast, that's for sure. and so Darwin is given the lion's share of the credit, although Wallace is still known, at least to historians, and making a little bit of a comeback, thanks to people like me that write books about him, just because I think he's an interesting character. But anyway, why did it take so long in the first place? Well, if he had it all figured out in the early 1840s, and he didn't publish until 59, why so long? Well, two reasons. One is that in 1844 there was a book published called The Vestiges of Creation by Anonymous, the guy named Chambers, but in any case he didn't want to be known at the time. And the book was panned by the critics. The scientific critics said this is bunk. It was a book on evolution. But there were lots of theories of evolution. Nobody had a mechanism. Without a mechanism, anybody can come up with half a dozen interesting theories before breakfast, right? It's not that hard to do. You just sit around and think of interesting ideas. It's actually putting it to the test, finding some way to test it, and having some mechanism that drives it. It's like vagonary, continental drift. That's interesting. What could make continents move across the face of the earth? Impossible until somebody figured out the mechanism, and then it becomes part of science. So until he actually had a pretty good base